Cool. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I'll just jump right in now because we've got quite a bit to get through on the agenda. So I'm sure people will dial in, but we are recording in case people come in a bit late, they can watch it back. But I'll just start by and doing an acknowledgement of country and acknowledge that that we meet on Aboriginal land in Sydney. I'm here on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So I'll pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, but also acknowledge that we are a national network and we meet on different land across the country. So I guess you ought to sort of reflect on that and the land that you live on as well. Cool. So there's a fair few of us and a lot to get through, so we're not going to be able to do the usual introductions and sort of thing that we usually do. But I thought we'd just kind of do a quick talk through who's sort of going to be running through what tonight, and also a quick tech setup. So Siri, who's our campaigns and organising officer, will be talking you through this new campaign that we're launching, and Soleil is going to talk through. So Siri will talk through sort of the issue and do the analysis around that and the solution that we're proposing. And then Soleil will take you through the messaging. She's done some messaging testing on this, and we're going to talk about how we can talk about this campaign. Sorry, I'm going to the wrong one now. And then I'll sort of talk about tactics. But before we get into it, I might just ask everyone to mute themselves just for so we can hear each other. So there's a little mute button. If you go to your window, I think I already noticed the sound's kind of cleared up a little bit. But if you're struggling to find it, if you hover over your face on the screen, it should come up with like a little mute button. I can also mute you for you if you're being loud, but just to eliminate background noise. Obviously we don't want you to not be able to speak, but just to make sure that the sound quality is really clear. So if you do want to speak, just remember that you have to unmute yourself, because often people will start talking and we don't know that you are. Also there'll be time for questions tonight at the end of sort of each segment, but there's also an option. If you go into, there'll be like a little menu bar, sometimes at the top, sometimes it's at the bottom, depending on where you've chosen to place it, and in the more section there's chat, so you can type your question into the chat box, and there's an option to type it to everyone or to type it directly to ActionAid, which would be like me, Siri and Soleil, because I think we're all on the same account. So just noting that, yeah, we will have dedicated time for questions, but you don't have to hold them to the end. Feel free to type them in there, because we'll be pausing throughout to answer questions. Also, sometimes we'll ask questions that will be addressed later. So just pop them in there if anything does come up. Also, we're keen for you to write them down, because we're going to create an FAQ guide on this campaign. So actually it's really good for us to capture the questions that are coming up on this campaign, and that will help us create a bit more of a guide for activists on how to answer questions on this in the future. So because a lot of you will be fresh to this campaign, I think you'll probably be the best people to input into what that guide will look like, and what questions are coming up for you as you're kind of new to it and you're hearing it for the first time. Cool. So the global campaign. Okay, so this has been something that has been a long time coming, and I'm sure many of you have heard us talking about it for a while now. But ActionAid, as a federation of 45 countries, decided we're going to be working on a global campaign, so a campaign that can work for all countries. So obviously that's in theory like amazing, but like in the practicalities of it, having something that kind of aligns across all different countries and all different contexts is quite a process. And other organisations like Oxfam have had a global campaign around like what's called like fiscal justice, where all offices are looking at gender responsive budgeting. So ActionAid in a similar way has gone on this process to look at how can we be really influential as a federation, work towards like a similar goal, and kind of put our power in different places and put pressure on different points. And so we sort of worked together and came to a broad campaign area, which was women's decent work, labour and public services. So that was kind of the overarching theme of the campaign. And then what happened in regions, we met to develop sort of partnerships and flesh out like linkages and different themes that may play out across regions. So last year I went to Vietnam and met with them and sort of fleshed out what other countries are looking at working on, what's happening in their context and where we might be able to overlap. From there, we sort of refined it a little bit more, started thinking about what are the issues in this campaign that Australia can work on. And as Action Aid Australia, we formed a working group with staff that kind of were across teams, so not just campaigns, but also programs and fundraising and communications, and created a working group where we mapped out all of these issues. I think we probably had 6 or 7 issues that related to the theme of women's decent work, labour and public services. We did basically an analysis of all the issues and where we and then decided where we might have the most impact. And from that, we've come to the campaign on gender and trade, and that was identified as an area where we think Australia can have a really good impact and is really timely for us as well. The next step in this process was that we brought activists together to meet up in March. So a lot of you probably know about this and maybe came along to that as well. But that was a 2-day strategy meeting where activists sort of were firstly shown the tools of creating a campaign strategy, like how we do it, what are the frameworks, that sort of thing. And from that, we talked to them about this campaign that you'll hear about tonight, and they developed their own state-by-state plans. And that's largely shaped like the tactics and fed into like kind of the broader national plan for this. And also we took away from that strategy meetup, like what are the resources that we need to create to support activists in carrying out those plans. And we'll talk to you about like what we've done since the strategy meetup to create resources and get ready for you guys to start working on this. And then I guess this is the official launch of this campaign to the Activist Network. And then the next step will be publicly launching it on the 1st of May, which is International Labour Day. So yes, it's been a bit of a journey, but we've got there and we're really excited to launch it with you guys. But I just wanted to share with you sort of where this has come from and the process we've taken to getting it to this point. So overview of what's going to happen tonight. I spoke a bit about this already, but Siri's going to go into what's free trade, how does it impact on women, and then look at the solution. Soleil's been doing some really cool message testing, looking at what's resonating people. We're very aware that trade isn't the most exciting word, and for a lot of people that doesn't really ignite their passion for women's rights, and you know, it's not a real kind of thing that's really spoken about a lot. So we've been looking at what's resonating with people and how do we talk about this with the general public. So Soleil can give you some pointers on that and talk about the work she's been doing. Then I'm going to talk through the Activist Network tactics, so what came out of that strategy weekend, and how we've sort of shaped that and brought that together for sort of this phase of the campaign, and then questions. Okay, cool. So I'll hand it over to Siri, and she's going to introduce the campaign.
I just had to remember to unmute myself, so handy pointer there if you're going to talk. Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the campaign, obviously, but also just a little bit in general about free trade, because it's something some people might have studied at uni, you might have heard about it, and I think like politicians and just generally it's spoken about in a really positive way. So I guess free trade is like very much a neoliberal principle that is around reducing what are called barriers to trade and investment. So the idea is to kind of I guess the theory behind it is to promote economic growth across the world, and promote trade as this great way to create economic growth, which I guess in trickle-down economics, you know, translates to development outcomes. So yeah, especially like if you jump onto the DFAT website, you'll see how they talk about it as great for Australian businesses in terms of opening up new markets and things like this. But in reality, what we're seeing is that free trade does really great things for corporations and for big business, but in reality, what it's actually doing is compromising people's rights, and especially women's rights, which is obviously a really huge focus to ActionAid. Yes, okay. I'm not sure what the next slide is, Liz. I might get you to just pop it over. Okay, so I guess there's a big question, like how does free trade translate into a women's rights issue? And yeah, it's a really good one. I guess like the main thing, one thing to start off with is that we know that trade can technically, in theory, be great for women's rights, and you'll see online like big like the government, but also big organizations like the World Trade Organization, they talk about how free trade has a role to play in kind of creating gender equality across the world. So I guess to start off, we're not necessarily, ActionAid's position isn't that we're completely against free trade, but what we want is for free trade to be done in a better way, because what we're seeing at the moment is that free trade is having these really like awful impacts on women's rights, especially in low-income countries, which is great because we have a lovely infographic here, which I'll talk through now. So I guess like the first area is around undermining public services. So free trade deals, they kind of have two parts to them which affect public services. So the first is around tariff reductions. So tariffs are kind of, I guess you can think about them as taxes that governments use to kind of protect their local industries. So one example is that Mexico, they have a really, really big indigenous, they have a huge, national corn industry, which is often, I think the majority of the farmers are indigenous farmers. But when Mexico entered into the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, what happened was that they had to reduce those taxes which were protecting those industries. And so tariffs protect that. But so tariffs are also really important because, and this is kind of the link to public services, what they do is they actually give governments revenue. So I think in the Asia Pacific, I think it was about 17 or 19%, don't quote me on that figure, but like a significant portion of government revenue comes from tariffs on imports. So free trade agreements work to reduce those tariffs or eliminate them, which means that governments aren't getting enough revenue, which means that they can't fund public services. And it also works, free trade agreements, they also work to encourage privatization. So they create opportunities for big corporations who might specialize in a service to come into a country and take over the distribution of whatever that service is. So I guess the women's rights link here is that public services are really key to, they're often a really important thing for women, and they're often key to like kind of promoting gender equality, especially in low-income countries, which is obviously our focus here tonight. So, for example, when a family member might become sick, what we know is that because of traditional gender roles, women will be often the ones who have to take care of a sick family member. So if that service has been privatized and it's no longer affordable, or it's no longer of a good quality, women will have to kind of devote time to looking after a family member, when, you know, what should happen is that they should be able to take that family member to a public hospital and get care. And that obviously has implications for the amount of time that they have to do other things, to work, or to I guess get on with other parts of their lives. So public services are really important, and that extends to healthcare, but also things like education, water, electricity, public transport, like a whole area of public services which are undermined by these free trade deals. So the second area is around threatening women's access to decent work. So we know through lots of research that women in low-income countries are often they often smallholder farm, like farmers. So they don't have these huge kind of agro-business farms, but they have maybe like a plot of land where we're growing, I guess, like fruits and vegetables for themselves, but also, you know, taking the surplus to their markets and kind of generating a little bit of income from that. We also know that they are often really involved in local businesses and also in public services. So what happens when countries enter into free trade agreements is that these kind of smaller businesses and kind of smaller farms are really threatened by big foreign corporations, which can come in and really undercut those smaller businesses, because they, you know, can mass produce things, or they can pay their workers less, or things like that. So it threatens women's access to decent work, in the fact that, you know, that it increases the competition that they're facing. What we also know is that corporations can kind of, free trade agreements loosen up the rules around companies being able to go in and buy large plots of land in countries, and especially in low-income countries. So seeing, especially in the Asia Pacific, that big companies are already going into a lot of these countries and buying big tracts of land, and we know that women often don't have kind of the land tenure security that men benefit from. So it's affecting women smallholder farmers in that way as well. And I guess kind of the last point around that is around there's kind of like what's called a race to the bottom in terms of workers' rights and also wages. So the whole thing about free trade is that, you know, it comes down to I guess market competition, and to be competitive in the global market, businesses are finding more and more that you have to cut costs, and often these costs will be in terms of paying people decent wages, but also, you know, limiting workers' rights, so they're not able to unionize, they're not able to protest, they're not able to strike. So we're seeing that, you know, that free trade agreements are really privileging corporations in the sense that, you know, it's corporations, you know, you've got to be competitive in this new global market, and to be competitive, you've got to undercut these other areas. You also might have heard about special economic zones, which are often a part of free trade deals. And these special economic zones often, you know, they have special provisions around, you know, kind of eliminating a lot of workers' rights and things like that, and are very problematic. So the next one I want to talk about is around increasing the exploitation of vulnerable groups. So free trade deals, and for example, you might have heard of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which went through our parliament last year and was in the news a bit. They have a provision in them which increases temporary migration. So, okay, in theory, again, this could work really well, so that people from low-income countries can come to Australia and find work which is often perhaps got a higher salary than what they could have back in their home countries. And it's yeah, in theory it can be a really great thing for people to be making more money. But what we're seeing is that often temporary migrant women workers are coming into Australia and they're actually being exploited in a number of ways. So we know that the Asian Women at Work, which is an NGO that operate here in Australia, they did some research and they found out that migrant and refugee workers, women workers in Australia, have been frequently underpaid, received incorrect leave entitlements, were unfairly dismissed, bullied and harassed, and suffered from bad health due to their work. So basically what we're seeing is that these temporary workers often might not be as aware of their rights, and they're getting into situations where employers, you know, due to the differentials in power and power imbalances, they're being exploited because either then they're not 100% sure what their rights are as workers, but also they these temporary migration schemes tie them to one employer, so they're often scared to speak out, because if they speak out and their boss fires them, for example, then they can be deported back to their own country. So there's a really big issue around the exploitation of vulnerable groups. And the last point is around prioritizing corporate interests over public good. So I guess this is, the umbrella for everything that free trade agreements do. But I guess the one extra point that I want to make about this is that a lot of these free trade deals are including a provision which is called investor-state dispute settlement. Okay, really fancy term for a really, really awful mechanism in free trade agreements, which allows companies to basically sue governments if governments try to regulate and the regulations impact on the profit-making ability of that company. Sounds just crazy. It is just so crazy. I don't know how they got away with this one. Hopefully they're not going to get away with it, because we're going to fight to not have it in. But yeah, basically ISDS, just call it ISDS. It's much easier to remember. It is really, I guess there's a general consensus, or a consensus emerging now, that it's actually discouraging governments from regulating in the interests of public good. And basically, so a few of you might have heard when Philip Morris, the cigarette company, sued the Australian government over the plain packaging laws that were brought in. So basically, Philip Morris said, "Hey, look, people aren't going to buy our cigarettes if you've got plain packaging. We're losing money from this. We're going to take you to court." Okay, in the end, so there's hundreds and hundreds of these cases. In the end, Philip Morris lost that fight and the Australian government won. But what's been revealed is that the Australian government still had to pay over $12 million in fees despite being awarded costs. So this is just one example. There have been examples of awards. There was an award in Mexico of $2.4 billion when when the government ordered I think it was an oil and gas company to clean up a toxic waste spill. Basically, the company was able to sue the government, and they were awarded $2.4 billion, which was equivalent to Ecuador's health budget for that year. So we're talking really crazy numbers. This is just it's completely outrageous. And it's just a very blatant example of how free trade agreements are really prioritizing the rights of big corporations over public good. So we have just a case study to quickly go through. So I want to talk about Oji from Nigeria, and she, I guess a few people might recognize her if you were around when we were doing some work on beneficial ownership. But basically, she's a nurse in Nigeria, and she previously worked in a hospital, was paid a salary, was able to support her family from that salary, just like you would expect. But a change in government in Nigeria meant that the government actually cut funding to that hospital because they didn't have the public revenue that they needed to pay their staff, to pay the nurses like Oji. So she's actually been working at the hospital for no salary, just because they need hospitals. They need people there, for example, to help to deliver babies and to look after the sick people. But obviously, it's not sustainable, and she can't go on, living without a wage. And I guess this is kind of a symptomatic of what we will start to see more broadly as governments have their public revenue cut by free trade agreements, working to kind of reduce those tariffs, and also having to pay giant payouts to huge companies as well. Actually, another thing I wanted to mention, I don't feel like you need to remember everything that I'm saying at the moment. What we've done is we've actually put together an activist briefing, and I think, Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's on the activist toolkit section of our website now. So if you jump on there after the webinar, you'll be able to download it, and it's got all of these aspects to free trade explained, probably in a much better way than I'm explaining it now. So feel like you can go back to it at any time, and yeah, the information will be there. And there's also kind of a much longer explanation of the case study that we have here from Nigeria, with a few quotes from her as well, which is really great. And we'll have more case studies coming out. Great. So we have this amazing opportunity coming up, and it's what I'm going to talk to you all about, and what the rest of the webinar is basically going to be about. I just wanted to just add a point as well, that we're going to be working specifically on one big free trade agreement in the near future, but we're also going to be doing some more kind of advocacy work around changing the Australian government policy around gender and trade. But that, yeah, it's we're not going to talk too much about that today, but just to let you know that it will be going on as well throughout this campaign. So our big opportunity is, number one, that there's going to be an election, as you would know, in about a month now, which is very soon. And okay, so when we obviously don't know the outcome of the election, but we're kind of assuming that perhaps, you know, that a Labor government might be going to, come in a month's time. And obviously that's just an assumption. We can't say that for 100% yet, but we're working on that assumption. And we know that the Labor Party do have actually some I guess some strong policies on trade. So they're not perfect by any means, but they're definitely a lot more, I guess, open to listening to arguments around trade than the LNP, the coalition. So we might have a more friendly government in a few more weeks. So that's one great thing. That's one opportunity coming up. And then I guess the other big thing is this huge free trade agreement that Australia is participating in the negotiations for at the moment. It's been ongoing for a few years now, and it's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Ridiculous name. Feel free to shorten it to RCEP. Very easy to remember, not so ridiculous. And it is, it's just an enormous trade deal. So it's regional. It obviously Australia is part of it, but it's also covering the 10 ASEAN nations, and also big economies like China and India. New Zealand's also a part of it. There's a map there, so you can kind of have a little bit of a visual about where the areas that it covers. And yeah, we're talking half of the world's population, almost half of the world population will be covered by this deal. And I think it's just under 30% of global GDP is also going to be covered by this trade deal. So it's huge. It's one of the biggest trade deals ever, basically. And we know that the negotiation process is ongoing. So it's been, as I mentioned, it's been going on for a few years now. And through leaks and I guess the general conversation, we know that this deal is going to probably contain a lot of the really concerning elements that we spoke about above. For example, the ISDS mechanism, where companies can sue governments. So at the moment, that's a part of the deal. Great. So I guess our opportunity here is we want to try to influence the negotiation process. So there's obviously work to be done to make sure that this deal, if it goes ahead, is more gender responsive, that it takes into account some of the things that we spoke about before. And I guess at the end of the day, there's also an opportunity to influence whether or not the government, whoever is in at that time, actually sign and ratify that deal. So they can go through the whole negotiation process and bring it back to Parliament at the end. But if it doesn't pass through both houses of Parliament, then that deal, Australia's participation in that deal won't go ahead. So that's going on throughout the year, but I have an extra opportunity that one of the negotiation rounds is actually going to be in Melbourne at the end of June. So I think it's the 28th of June until the 3rd of July. And that's just going to be such a great focal moment to start conversations with politicians, but also to kind of get media and get this on the public agenda, and start to challenge that narrative around free trade being just amazing for low-income countries, but also start the conversation about what are some of the concerning impacts of it as well. I'll briefly go through our key targets for this. So you'll recognise some of the names here and that they're mostly Labor Party names. So obviously we're working on the assumption that Labor will come into the government, but I guess it's also worth mentioning that even if they don't, Labor will be like a really important party for us to get on side if we want to block the RCEP deal passing through Parliament at the end of negotiations. So whatever happens, these will still be really key targets for us, whether or not they're in government or not. So obviously Bill Shorten might be the next Prime Minister, so the buck basically stops with him as to whether or not this passes. Penny Wong is likely to be the next Foreign Affairs Minister. So she's kind of broadly responsible for this, but kind of her junior minister is Jason Clare, who's currently the shadow minister for trade and investment, and if they win will become probably the Minister for Trade and Investment. So he's the one responsible for, going to the negotiations, and he's definitely, I guess, one of our really, really, really key targets in this. I mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership a bit before, and what we know from what happened last year was that a lot of people in the Labor Party have some really decent and very legitimate concerns about free trade and how it's kind of being, how people are going about it at the moment. So we have, some information about backbench champions who spoke out internally about supporting the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I definitely encourage everyone to kind of get in touch if you want to talk more about your local MP or senator, and we can start to talk about who would be a good person to kind of get inside. And we really want to get as many backbench champions as we can, because we know that they're going to be really key to talking to Jason Clare and to Penny Wong and to Bill Shorten and saying that, people in my electorate are talking about this, I'm going to stand up and speak publicly on this, and we'll really start to build the pressure. And of course, the last one is the crossbench. So we don't know what the crossbench will look like post-election. It's likely that there'll be quite a few independents sitting there. And if we want to stop the bill getting through the Senate, they will be really key to making sure that the deal doesn't go ahead unless it is taking into account our gender concerns. Okay, I just spoke a lot really quickly. Hopefully some of that made sense. I definitely would suggest going back to the activist briefing and having a read through it. Hopefully, I can start to start conversations about it and things as well. But I guess Slay's going to talk a bit more about messaging and how you can actually start to have those conversations, and that's exciting. I wonder, I'm not sure what the time is, but are there any kind of is anyone dying to ask a question? I guess at the moment. I can't see everyone, so has anyone got...
Hi, can I ask a question?
Yes,
hi,
totally.
it's Freya. I just wanted to know if their strategy is also going to talk about the climate change impacts of free trade and the trickle down effects that will have on gender equality as well.
It's a really good point. I think that we haven't actually done too much work on that yet, but I think it's actually a really important part of free trade deals, because obviously, they have really important climate change implications.
I think it's the biggest cause of fossil fuels is free trade.
There you go. Okay, then we'll definitely take that back to the strategy, because I think that it's a really really important thing. Also a great way to talk about it as it being an issue that is affecting everyone and not just being an issue that affects people overseas. So definitely. Thanks Freya. Anybody else?
Siri, it's Courtney.
Hi Courtney.
Hi. I'm just wondering about the the evidence base for this. like I personally, and maybe other people would really like to have some of the reading for like the basis for the arguments.
Yeah, totally. Yes, so it's funny, I wasn't sure how much reading people would want to do. So there's definitely been lots of research. I think this is like an emerging area as people are kind of getting to terms with the fact that it does have women's rights implications. So, I mean, there's lots of stuff online, and I'll make a note to share kind of the key articles with you. So, I mean, you've got you've got people in the UN speaking out about it. You've got even like the World Trade Organization coming out and with reports around the fact that they recognize that there are women's rights implications, and there's also lots of other organizations working on this globally. I know that ActionAid UK have a really great report around this, and other organizations which I can share with you all, and probably have a lot more of the, they can provide more examples, more facts and figures and things like that, which I think would be helpful.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
No, of course. I think it's, really important to be grounded in the research, definitely. All right. Anybody else quickly? Otherwise, I know Slay has some very interesting stuff to share. Great. Okay. I'll hand it over to Slay.
Okay. I think I'm unmuted. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. After that, where Siri has done an excellent job of kind of talking through the issue, there's a lot of facts and a lot of information, but what we try and do when it comes to messaging a lot of the time is kind of simplify it as much as possible, and kind of think about how we can talk about this issue in a way that will get through to people. I'll be talking a bit in this section about our process for coming up with key messages for a campaign and what we've come up with, and hopefully leave you feeling a bit more confident talking about it. And as others have mentioned, if you have any questions that come up while I'm talking, feel free to write them in the chat, and then can address them at the end, or see if you have any questions at the end as well. So in terms of the process, what we've got up on the slide here, you can see. So I heard some of you were kind of interested in this side of thing. Hopefully you are, especially those of you who joined the webinar with Gemma, which was a little while ago, where she was talking about values and frames and things like that. That's an area that I find really interesting. So essentially, as you might know already, there's lots of different ways that you can communicate about one thing. Obviously, there's a lot to know about gender and trade, and so we are kind of thinking there's lots of different angles we could take when we talk about this to the public. And especially when you're trying to motivate people to take action, the words that you use to do that can actually make a really big difference, which is why it's kind of an exciting area to be thinking about. So what we like to do at the start of a campaign is it's kind of an opportunity to evaluate all that before you come up with all your core campaign materials. So what we'll do is what we have done is we got into a bit of a group and brainstormed lots of different ways that we could talk about trade. And then what we did is do some paid advertising using Facebook ads to try and get some evidence and some data around what the public is responding to the most, and then kind of basically gathering an evidence base that will allow us to narrow down all of those ideas that we had into kind of a couple really core messages that we'll use to guide the way we talk about the campaign. When we're going about this, to kind of break down your messaging into something that's simple enough to test, we found it helpful to separate the thinking into basic thinking about how do we talk about the problem of the campaign. So in this case, what's bad about the RCEP trade deal, and then how do we talk about the solution? So what are we campaigning for? What do we want people to do? And then we'll come up basically with a few different ways of talking about the problem and a few different ways of talking about the solution. And the key here for trying to get interesting results is to try your best to make your problem frames as different from each other as possible, and that can sometimes be the hardest part, actually. And I was going to mention here that for those of you who were on the webinar with Gemma, she was talking a bit about the common cause values and frames approach. I'm not going to go into that too much, but just a reference for those of you who are aware. So there's intrinsic values and extrinsic values that can be triggered with certain language. And so while we tried to kind of think of quite different ways of talking about the problem, I'd say they probably all fit on the intrinsic side. So they're all kind of triggering values of, it's called benevolence. So it's like universalism, like kind of human rights, like care for other people, those kind of values. So yeah, although they are different from each other, they're not that different that we're kind of coming from opposite sides of the messaging spectrum, just to be clear about that. So in this situation, we tested 3 problem frames. So the first one we were testing was, you can see, I'll just stay on that one, So you can see like these are screenshots of the actual ads we were running. So we had 3 of them, there's only 2 here, and they look pretty much identical, but you can see that the text above the petition is a little bit different. So on the left-hand side, or my left-hand side, we've got the Australian government's considering signing a dodgy new deal that would trade women's rights for corporate rights. So that was kind of plain and simple, trading women's rights for corporate rights. On the right-hand side, we've got one which kind of takes an angle looking at the garment sector, so how the fast fashion industry is connected to free trade agreements. And we did that because, well, first of all, from the other trainings and feedback from you guys, it seemed like the garment sector stuff was an angle that was really resonating with people. It's also quite topical, and a lot of people kind of are aware of that issue a bit more than they might be about trade deals in general. So we sort of thought it'd be interesting to see how that would go. And then the third frame we were testing was sort of breaking down RCEP into winners and losers. So kind of who are the winners from this deal and who are the losers, the winners being big corporations and the losers being women communities, pretty much everyone else, including the government. As you can see here, like everything is basically the same. The image is the same. The petition link is the same. The audiences that we were targeting were the same. So that was, we are able to upload a list, or basically like a spreadsheet of our email list into Facebook. And Facebook will kind of match that up. And so it means that we're serving our ads to the people that are also on our email list, and then what's called a lookalike of that list. So it also finds a larger group of people that kind of match the similar interests and demographics of the people on our email list. So yeah, just pointing out that I guess we're testing messaging with our base. So the people that we know are generally kind of interested in the issues that we work on. So then how we measure kind of success, like how do we decide what is actually the winning message is, so in this case, because we were doing it on a petition, we'll look at kind of how many petition signatures did we get on the different ads, and then also engagement. So did one of them get, way more likes and comments and shares and things like that. This spreadsheet, I'll just say, don't expect any of you guys to actually be able to read it. It's quite small, but it's just kind of a snapshot into what it'll look like on the back end when I'm kind of like looking at all these numbers. And it's really a lot of like numbers and calculating kind of when it comes down to it. So what you're looking for is obviously a difference between the different frames. And then you can do some kind of calculations, which I can't do myself, but luckily there's some online tools that make it really easy. So what you're looking is for like a big enough difference that it's statistically significant. So it's not just like this one got 52 signatures, the other one got 50. So the 52 is the winner. It actually has to be quite a big difference for you to say, oh, this is clearly the winner. But what's interesting is that we do quite often get statistically significant results. So in this case, if we go to the next slide, we can announce what the winners were. I guess I'll just quickly say a last point on the process is, so in the first set of ads, we'll just test the way we're talking about the problem, and we'll just kind of use a generic line that's the same in all of them for the solution. So like, sign the petition or something like that. And then once we think we've got a winning frame for the problem, then we'll go back and test all the solution frames. So then the problem will be the same in all of them, but we're testing different ways of asking people to take action, basically. So what we've come up with for this campaign, following that method, is this is the most successful way of talking about the problem. Basically, the government's considering signing a dodgy new deal that would trade women's rights for corporate rights. And for the solution, people power can win over corporate power if we stand together during the campaign. So interestingly, there's kind of a link between those two, are kind of the most similar ones as well. And the overarching message is this is a conversation not about free trade, but about people power and women's rights versus corporate power. Which, it's sort of unsurprising, I guess, that one performed the best. It's probably the simplest. It's kind of, you can read it right away and understand that it's unfair, that there's a problem there. And it sort of got through to people, even if they didn't understand all the ways why trade was important or why trade impacted women's rights. It's a reframing of the way people might think about trade, or maybe have been taught to think about trade. We can. One thing I'll mention before this is that there's also, in the activist briefing that Siri and Liz mentioned, you'll find this the problem and solution frame written down, and there's also an elevator pitch, so kind of a couple sentences that sum up the whole campaign. So just look out for that in that document. So then in terms of strategic conversation, so this is how you kind of put this stuff in practice, and think about how you'll talk about this campaign when you're actually doing community outreach and engagement, which I know you guys are planning to do. So I won't really talk through kind of what this framework is about, because most of you are probably familiar with it from previous trainings. But if you need a refresher, that's all in the activist briefing document as well. But I thought I could maybe just talk through quickly some of the suggested scripts from a messaging perspective. So if we start with the introduction, obviously this is a part where you introduce yourself and you kind of mention the issue for the first time. So I guess the point is here, think about your messaging and how you're communicating the campaign right from the beginning. This is the point where you'll hook people's attention, and you could stop someone or start talking to them and say, hey, I want to talk to you about gender and trade, and their eyes might glaze over. They might not necessarily make the connection, or you could say, we want to talk to you about our campaign to stop Australia from signing another dodgy trade deal. Or you could bring in the corporate power, you could start by saying Australia's considering signing a new trade deal that would trade women's rights for corporate rights. You could say that right at the beginning. And that would probably get someone a bit interested and go what are you talking about? What does that mean? So next, this is, probably you don't need to worry so much about messaging in this part. This is the building rapport section where you kind of chat to someone, get to know them a bit, share your story about why you're involved. But this can be helpful in terms of getting to know the person and maybe what you think they're interested in. And then you can use that when you're in the next section to kind of know what areas to focus on. So the third section, outrage part. So this is where you kind of bringing up the problem for the first time and getting into it and breaking that down for people. So this is where you definitely bring in your key message about the problem. So you see that's the opening line. So right now the government's considering signing a dodgy new deal that would trade women's rights for corporate rights. And then you can go into a bit more detail. This deal is called RCEP, covers nearly 50% of the world's population. And like many deals, it will have significant negative impacts for women's rights and gender equality, particularly in low-income countries. And then continue on still in this section, then you would go into, we've kind of broken it down to 3 key ways that the deal impacts women's rights. So when you're talking about these, it can be helpful, again, always be trying to link back to your core message, which is women's rights versus corporate rights. So the 3 ways we kind of distilled it to is, so deals like RCEP undermine the government's ability to provide public services that women rely on by reducing tariffs and therefore government revenue. So just a simpler way of saying what Siri was talking about earlier. It's threatening women's access to decent jobs by encouraging large multinational companies to open operations in areas like the garment sector, driving down wages and undermining workers' rights, and giving corporations the power to sue governments if they feel their profits are threatened. And you don't have to kind of memorize everything. You don't have to go into detail about all of the different women's rights impacts. You could probably just pick 1 or 2 of these impacts that you want to speak about, and try to fit it into that overarching frame. As I was saying earlier, if maybe you've built some good rapport with someone, you know that they're really passionate about ethical fashion or something like that, maybe that's the area that you'll focus on. Or if you know they're a nurse, like they're a healthcare worker, maybe you want to talk about public services instead. So that's the way you can go about it. Then the next section is hope. So you've just made them angry about the issue. This is where you start talking about your solution messaging. So our dominant frame here is people power can win over corporate power, and that's how we're going to win this campaign. So talking about, how we're going to do that, and that we have an important opportunity in Australia this year to influence the negotiations. But to do this, we need to grow the power of our movement and turn up the pressure on our government to take a stand for women's rights. So, I guess that in terms of messaging, it's just kind of trying to fit everything into that umbrella frame of people power winning over corporate power. So that's kind of what we found, probably the way that you'll inspire people the most to take action and feel like what they're doing can actually make a difference. And then the action is just kind of more specifically what your ask is. So will you sign the petition or whatever it is you're asking them to do? The point here is that you might feel like you're being repetitive, like you're talking about corporate power a lot, or you're talking about people power constantly. But, and Gemma might have mentioned this as well, research shows that you actually need to repeat your messages many, many times before they actually sink in for people. And that's what politicians do. You'll see that in the media a lot. People are kind of actually saying the same lines over and over again. And that's someone will come away from that conversation and that's what they'll remember. So don't worry about being repetitive, basically. That's kind of all I was going to say on that. Does anyone have any questions? I don't think anyone's put them in the chat, but jump in if you have any burning questions. Or we can just look at the dogs. Okay, well, if anything comes to mind later, you can always let Liz and Siri know and we can chat more about that. So I'm handing over to Liz for some talking about tactics.
Cool. Okay, cool. I just feel like leaving it on the slide for a little bit longer to look at the dogs. But I'm going to talk to you about tactics now. So hopefully now that's quite clear.
Liz, I think you might.
Am I on mute? Can you hear me? Okay, cool. You're on mute now, Soleil. Okay. So hopefully now the issue is really clear and you feel a bit more confident in communicating the message, because that was a lot of the feedback we were getting from activists, is that this can be quite complex, and you can have a really good understanding, but then when it comes to actually talking to someone at a market stall or a friend or a family member, knowing what to say and how to communicate it can be a whole different thing. So hopefully that's been really useful. But again, we've got the activist briefing on the website, so you can go and have a read over that again and just make sure you're really comfortable with it. Also, if there are other things that you feel more comfortable speaking about, we just encourage you to kind of do what's most comfortable and what comes most naturally to you. It's never fun to kind of feel like you're reading off something in a really stilted way. So, but that's sort of the issue, the solution, and what we're working towards in this campaign. And now I'm going to take you through tactics. And this has largely been built off what activists came up with at that strategy weekend. They planned from March till July, when the RCEP negotiations are taking place. And what we've tried to do is group those tactics. We found that everyone's tactics sort of fit a similar timeline. So we're trying to group them nationally so they're very coherent and consolidated across the network, because we feel like we're definitely more powerful and could put pressure on if we're working together across the country. So hopefully this makes sense. We're not trying to add more tactics. We're trying to work with what activists are already doing and just try to group them together. So the overall tactics. So at the National Strategy Weekend, we did a national mobilisation brainstorm. So basically, what can we all do in terms of mobilising around the country? So we have this one action that everyone's doing. And everyone came up with ideas, and then we voted. And the winning idea was we wanted to do something with banners, which was a little bit broad. And the campaigns team have taken that away and refined that and gotten it to where it is today. So the banner idea is this. So we are going to have a banner per state, and we're going to send them out. And we're asking each state to decorate those banners with community messages, images, whatever sort of you want to put on there. It's your banner, and we want you to represent your community and how they're feeling on this issue. The banner is also going to be used for MP engagement opportunities. So if you want to put pressure on your MP, you can turn up with the banner, talk to their staffer about messages, see if they're there, see if they want to take a photo, do a photo stunt out the front. But the main purpose is, once we've got all these decorated banners, we're going to bring all of the banners to Melbourne and sew them together to form a giant banner. I don't know what's going on with the spelling on the slide, but it's going to be a giant banner that we're going to display at the front of the negotiations. And we're going to bring the messages from communities across Australia to Melbourne, where the negotiations are taking place. So this is the overall idea. I'll go into a bit more detail, but just saying that if you were there at the weekend, we've sort of built off this idea and hoping to make it a national tactic. So we've kind of gone and phased out this campaign. We're realising it's a bit of an awkward year with the election coming up, and very conscious that with the election being called, and a lot of the objectives is to get commitments from MPs around this deal, and saying that they're not going to sign on unless it considers gender. And to get a meeting with the MP is pretty unlikely in the lead up to an election, as they're all pretty focused on getting re-elected. So what the first phase is, so now basically until the election, is movement building. We're looking at doing awareness raising and outreach activities. Trade something that is not widely spoken about in the public. So this is a really good time and opportunity for you to start working with your groups and starting to do awareness raising in your communities. So the banner is a great way to do that, we thought, because you for people to sort of write something on it, they have to have a discussion with you, they need to get a bit of information, and they can then sort of write their message of support on the banner. And you can get those messages through a couple of ways. The first is like activism over dinner. Good to mention, we're going to launch a toolkit for activism over dinner that has a script for the trade campaign. Also, market stalls, amazing opportunity. I don't think there's anything better for talking to the public You just can have so many good conversations and meet people who are interested, invite them along to things. And it's proved like time and time again, just a really simple, effective way to build groups. Clothes swap. This is a really popular idea. Actually, Wollongong has organised one already, and it's taking place, I think, 2 weeks. And we actually, Soleil's working on a flyer that is specific, talking about like the garment sector and how that links to trade. So a clothes swap is sort of a fun way to bring people together, bring the banner along, get people to sign it, and swap clothes on the day and talk about trade. So that's basically what we're doing until the election. Also petitioning on the Activist Toolkit. I'm going to take you through that. Actually, I've decided to show you where everything is, but we've also put the petition up there, and it's downloadable and printable off the website. So if you do want to start getting petition signatures, we definitely encourage you to do so. I just want to remind you of the circles of commitment. A lot of you will be familiar with this framework. If you're not, it's adapted from a book called The Purpose-Driven Church, and it looks at like sort of how you can build your how you can build your church, but it's been adapted by campaigners to how you can build a movement. It's very translatable, and you're looking, I think, using these tactics, you're looking to build your circles of commitment. So looking at building your crowd and your contributors and people who are taking part in the campaign. Okay, you're saying, see you, Freya, so good to just keep that in mind when we're doing this movement building. It's also a good opportunity for you to build your groups and for you to get more people involved. Cool. So that takes us all the way to the election, which is happening May 18th. And basically, once we know the result of the election, we know what the cabinet looks like, we can do a bit of a reassessment, like, who are our targets still our targets? Has there been a reshuffle? Do we still have the same minister? Is Jason Clare the Minister for Trade? That sort of thing. This is kind of when we really kick off our MP engagement activities. So a lot of you have already met with MPs and you know this process very well. So what we're asking people to do then is to send in the meeting request to your MP. You can do this yourself. We're also offering you guys, we know that sometimes people struggle doing this. So if you do want staff to do it essentially on your behalf, we're happy to do that and follow up for you, because a lot of the effort, I think, in this is the follow-up and just making sure you're ringing the staffer and the diary manager and saying, how are you going with that meeting request? I still want this meeting. And it can be a process. I mean, obviously we want to empower you guys to be able to do that and feel really confident in getting a meeting with your MP, but also acknowledge some people have time restraints and don't have capacity. So please just let us know what you would prefer, because we are really happy to support you to do that. Please CC us into all your communications with MPs and senators, just so we don't have double up. It can get a bit messy with such a big network. So yeah, please just CC myself and Siri in, so we can also log it. We've got a database. It's linked here if you want to have a look. So if you do send out the meeting request, we don't have the resources ready yet because it's a little bit a while away, but we will send out like the meeting request template and all of that stuff in the lead up to the election results coming in. And also, if you are submitting that request yourself, a lot of follow-up. So in that spreadsheet, you can log when you followed up, who you've spoken to, remember the diary manager's name, and make sure you call back and ask for them to have start building that relationship. We found that, some of the better relationships with MPs we have, it always comes down to the diary manager. They're kind of like the gatekeeper. So if you've got a good relationship with them, you can have access to the MP, which can sometimes be quite hard. Cool. And then last sort of the date for this campaign is the third phase, is what we're calling it, which is the national mobilisation. So did I forget to mention something? No, I didn't. It's all good. Cool. So basically, this is when we're going to be really mobilising and doing the kind of the brunt of the work, I guess. So this is when we want to get banners. We want to get those decorated banners outside of MP offices and get a photo with them. And, so 2 weeks before the RCEP negotiations. So the RCEP negotiations, sorry, my headphone fell out, are taking place between the 28th of June and the 3rd of July. So it's good 2 weeks before that for you to take that banner. If you haven't heard back from your MP and you've sent in a meeting request to them, go outside their office, take a picture, with the banner. And then you can ask, like, hey, I've had this meeting request. I've now got community messages. I've got community support. I'd really like to speak to the MP about this issue. Realistically, there's not a lot of time between the election and the negotiations. So you may not get the meeting before the negotiations, but the negotiations will be happening all the year. So it's not going to just be this one time. They will continue through over the course of the year. So even if you don't get them before the initial round of negotiations, it's still really important to follow up, and we're happy for that to happen throughout the year as well. And then what will happen is, with those banners, we'll ask you to send them all back to us, and we'll create that giant banner and take it down to Melbourne and coordinate with the Melbourne group to do that protest. One other thing on that, if you do get a meeting with your MP, it's really great. The main ask there is that we want MPs to make a public statement that they're not going to support RCEP in its current form. So we'll be sort of working more on that in the lead up to the election, what that will look like. But the idea that we have at the moment is that when MPs do well and they say that they're not going to support RCEP, we're going to give them like a trade trophy. So they're going to do trade awards, and just make sure that we're really highlighting MPs that do have a really good stance on this and are really strong, and reward them for that, and make them feel good about coming out and saying this sort of stuff. So I've made this timeline just to make it super clear for you all. I'm just going to try and move you down here. So this I can also share with you. I might post it in the Facebook group or send it via email. Key dates are at the top. So today is April 17th, and this is the official launch of the Activist Network. We're also launching with resources, which I'll take you through in a second. May 1st is a public launch of the campaign, and Soleil will be doing a lot of online stuff for that. So you'll look out for like a video I guess like a public petition launch, all those sort of things happening across our social media. May 18th is the federal election, and 28th of June to 3rd July is RCEP negotiations. So I sort of spelled out the 3 phases onto this timeline. So you've got the movement building phase, where we're doing banner decorating, petitioning, and awareness raising activities such as activism over dinner, market stalls, and clothes swaps. Feel free to be more creative, and if you've got any fresh ideas, we'd always love to hear them. Post-election, that's when we sort of hit it hard with the MP engagement, and we're looking to get as many MP meeting requests in as possible, but also start like bringing the banners to the MPs. Don't give them to your MP because we want them in Melbourne, but show your MP them. Hey, Maple. And then we're also looking at the Trophy Awards idea. And then from the 28th of June to the 3rd of July, that's when we're mobilising. So that will largely be in Melbourne when we're bringing all the banners together, but there'll probably be a lot of online stuff as well, or sending solidarity to the Melbourne group and that sort of thing. So that's it summarised. Hopefully that's clear. I'm just going to do a quick example. I've used Shamer here for an example of like an activist journey. So what this might look like for you practically. I mean, we've made Shamer a very overly ambitious, overachieving activist in this story. So don't feel like you have to live up to Shamer's standards. I mean, if you want to, that's amazing. But basically, this is sort of the journey that you might go on. So Shamer holds a clothes swap event to raise awareness on how trade deals can negatively impact on garment workers. She's already started doing this, so somewhat true. 20 people come to the event and they write messages on the banner. So that Shamer's done her movement building, she's done some outreach, she's found some new people for her group, and she's got community messages that she can then leverage and show the MP that she's got the support of the community. So after the election, Shamer sends in her meeting request to her local MP Sharon Bird and follow-ups with a phone call a week later. After 2 weeks, MPs take a while to get back to you. Shamer drops into Sharon's office with the Wollongong group and her decorated banner and a printed meeting request. Always a good idea to also give them a printed one. And she tells the staffer that people in the community are really interested in the issue and they've made this banner to take to the RCEP negotiations. Cool. So then Seamus sends the banner back to ActionAid. Important step. We do need the banners back. And that's for the team to take down to Melbourne. So thanks to Seamus' pressure on Sharon Bird through the meeting request and the banner drop at her office, she agrees to a meeting with the group. And in that meeting, Sharon agrees to post a statement on her Facebook page with a quote demonstrating her support for protecting women's rights in trade deals, and receives our Trade Trophy Award. So I know that seems like quite a long journey, but when we break it down, I mean, Sharon's done an event. She's done a banner drop at the office, and she's met with her MP, and that's over the course of a couple of months. So that's exceptional. So let us know what you have capacity for, but this is just sort of a really simple breakdown of how it might play out for you and your group. Also, Shama would have had the support of her group to do all of this and wouldn't be doing it alone, is another thing to state as well. Have I missed anything? Probably. So that's the example journey. Objectives. We really encourage you guys to set your own objectives, but we've kind of come up with some objectives as a bit of a guide for you as well. Because we always get a bit of different feedback. Some groups really do want a bit of guidance. Some groups prefer to sort of have their own thing. So just offering it, take what you like from it. Overall, our objective is we want 5,000 petition signatures. We think we can get 3,000 online through things like Facebook ads that Soleil showed you before. But we want to get 2,000 offline. And we've sort of broken that down. If each group aims to get 200 signatures, we'll far exceed this target. So 200, you can probably do at a market stall or an event. Probably a market stall. If you get 200 people to an event, that's huge. But do what you can. Like, obviously some groups may find this easier than others depending on their size. So don't feel like this is the number that you need to hit. Set what you think is realistic for you, but we always encourage you to aim high and try and stretch and challenge yourselves. Another objective is we want 6 beautifully decorated banners. So each state has one banner. At the next National Leadership Team meeting with all the state coordinators that's happening next week, we might talk about the logistics of that and how we distribute the banner. But you can use this at various events you're holding, and just make sure you give us enough time to send it to you because we're still creating them. But that's like, obviously, if we have 6 visual banners, that's a huge part of the national mobilisation. So everyone's playing a big role in that process. And then the last thing is a public commitment from MPs and senators. And this is probably the most important, and this is what we're working towards. So each group works towards having their local MP or senator come out publicly and make a commitment. I've said via social media, but if there are other ways you can think of, that's fine as well. And we'll be sort of figuring out exactly how you make that ask and making it really clear when we start launching that MP engagement work. But yeah, really think about your end goal is this commitment from your MP, and the petitions and the banners are like a means of getting there and a means of influencing them. Okay, cool. So next steps, I spoke about the NLT, but we've also got the activist toolkit. So I'll just quickly show you that now. Can you see this on my screen? It's loading. Can you see it now? Okay, let me stop share and reshare with my, here we go. Can you see it now? Cool. So this is the activist toolkit. So we've updated this. So you can see on the left-hand side, you've got the activist briefing. So you can click to download that. You've also got the petition. You can download that there as well. I'll also be putting this webinar up here if there are people in your group that couldn't make it, so they can watch it here. Also, remember, there's always other webinars if you feel like there are extra skills you want to explore and know more about. Event proposal form, if you do want to hold an event in relation to the campaign, please fill it out. It just helps us. And also the Facebook event template. And to come very soon, long awaited activism over dinner toolkit. So Siri's done a great job of pulling in the content of the campaign, and she's popped it in there into the template. We're just still waiting for sign off, and we'll design it, and hopefully we're expecting it to be up there next week, but we'll send an email when it is. Okay, I'm just going to reshare now with my slides. And is there anything else? Yes. The other things that in terms of resources that we'll be putting up are a close swap flyer. So if you are holding a close swap, we have a close swap specific flyer. We'll also put that up there. And Soleil's created a really cool infographic that we're still waiting on sign off for. So we'll also put the infographic up there. But in terms of next steps for your group, definitely encourage you to set objectives for the group and make plans. Hopefully some of the stuff here helps you to do that and inspires you to do that. And catch up with like the campaigns team if you want other guidance. Like, we're here to support you, and if you have further questions or need extra support, just reach out to myself or Siri or Soleil if you want any messaging or comm specific stuff as well, and we're definitely here to help you. And the last thing that we forgot to mention is the name of the campaign. We're thinking of calling it what was it? The Transform Trade for Women. So keen to hear your thoughts on that as well. How you feel about that. We've kind of gone through a bit of a process of brainstorming and coming up with a really kind of catchy title that really sums up the campaign. We chose Transform Trade for Women as we are looking to reshape trade and make it a really positive thing for women. And I really like kind of the active verb of transform. Like, it's kind of a bit revolutionary. Maybe that's just me. Cool. Okay, questions? None. Cool. Okay. Is that clear? Does anyone have any comments? Are people excited? Or we have one chat. Love it, Georgie. Thank you. Thanks for the support.
Actually, I had one question for the banner.
Yeah.
So, I'm just a bit confused. So each state gets a banner, but do we have to send the banner that we sign from here to Melbourne? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that's a really good question, because the logistics will be something that will need some tweaking. So yeah, each state gets a banner. So for example, New South Wales will have a banner. We'll try to get it ready for the Wollongong event. And then after that event, staff can take it to, like, the Western Sydney group has an event, for example. And I guess for you, it's quite easy because we're all Sydney based, but we want the banners to come back to the office eventually. So yeah, like, just making sure you have enough time to send it back to the office, and we'll obviously give you like postage budget as well for that. We don't expect you to foot the bill for postage. But yeah, just making sure they do come back, because then we're going to put them all together.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I was like, it's going to be a bit confusing, so ask. Any other questions? Yep. Okay. If you do have questions, we are creating an FAQ guide, so we are actually really wanting questions, and they'll help us. And if you think there's anything that might come up, thinking back to those strategic conversations, especially if you think when you're explaining to someone, people might ask you a question that you won't know how to answer, let us know and we can put that in the FAQs. Okay. All right. Cool. Thanks for coming, everyone. Hope you all have a really lovely night. Bye.
Bye.